Due to technical difficulties, I'm coming to you from my home office. Um, I pray that the surroundings aren't distracting, but rather that the Word of God that comes forth will be what you focus on. Um, our sermon today is called Life Lessons from a Prophet, and we can learn these life lessons from prophets throughout the scripture. I've chosen the prophet Habakkuk this morning to speak on, so we can learn from him certain things that I believe are very important that we can grasp from his life and his relationship with God and what he considered, things that God could and should be doing in reference to the nation that he was serving as a prophet. One of the things that the Bible does not tell us here in reference to this book here is who he was. Well, rather, we know his name, but we don't know where he came from. We know that he was a prophet that was prophesying to the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. We know that his ministry was around 600 BC. This particular book was written about 603 before Christ. Um, his name also means one who embraces. It could be that that meant he embraced. Someone saw this prophetic calling in him, and the name meant that he was embracing or wanted to embrace or was going to embrace his ministry, his calling in life, which was this prophet that he's called to be. Um, we don't know; those things are just assumptions that we make in reference to the person of Habakkuk. One thing we do know is that he was a prophet that prayed, and he prayed. He was led to pray for his nation. That was one of his greatest concerns was the nation that he was serving, and he saw how the nation had departed from God and had gone astray from the things of the Lord, and so his heart cries out that God will be merciful and show Himself in favor of the nation. And he realizes the iniquity and the despair that the sinfulness of the people and the rebellion of the people is causing, such that he says, therefore, the law is powerless and justice never goes forth. He says, for the wicked surround the righteous, therefore, perverse judgment proceeds. And he's been praying to God about this. He's concerned for the spiritual well-being of the nation. Um, like many of us are, we may be concerned for the spiritual well-being of the nation that we live in, and we're crying out that God do something, that brings something about, that our leaders be leaders who follow spiritual, biblical principles and be led, by righteousness, not by corruption and evil. And yet, unfortunately, that's what we're seeing today here in America. People are not following God, even though this nation was founded on godly principles. Yet we find all this that's happening, and maybe our hearts, just like the prophet Habakkuk, are crying out for God to come and move and do something to straighten us out. Our sinfulness, our rebellion against God has driven us so far from God that many believers who feel the burden are crying out to God, and they feel like the prophet Habakkuk felt at this moment. But not only that, sometimes we feel like the prophet also, because he himself says here, how long shall I cry, O Lord? He had been praying to God for quite some time. And how do we ask God how long? It seems like the heavens are bronze and our prayers are not passing up to heaven, and God is not listening to us as we speak. We are praying that God come and show Himself to us. And so we cry out to God. He's crying out to God. He's been crying out to God for a while. And he says in verse 2 here, even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. You see, he knows that the nation is going down the tubes, basically, but God is not moving on their behalf, and he's wondering why this is happening. Anyway, the fact is that God was going to answer at his own specific divine time, which he did, and he receives the response here of what God is going to do. And God tells him in verse 6, I'm raising up a nation, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. And they are the ones that are going to come. This bitter and hasty nation, which have conquered empires, they're the ones that are going to come and they're going to conquer you. And Habakkuk, he didn't like that response. He didn't like that response at all, because he is looking at the nation of Israel as a nation that served God, that had the righteous, the true, everlasting God. They served the true God. Yes, they had gone astray, but the true God was their God. And now God is going to bring a nation that worships idols to come and punish this nation. And he, in his heart, as a prophet, as his love for this people, he did not comprehend that. And he just didn't understand why God would do something like that. And so he questions God about it. He questions God about it. He says, there's just no way. And in verse 12, he says, are you not from everlasting? O Lord, my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. We shall not die. You have appointed them for judgment. You have marked them for correction. And they're going to judge us. They're going to make a decision about us, but that decision about us is going to be determined. It's a judicial decision determined upon them by God. He's going to use them, but they shall not die, he proclaims. He understands that God is going to take care of the situation, that he's bringing them for punishment, but he's not going to exterminate them from the land. He understands that, but yet he doesn't agree with the channel by which God is going to come and punish them. He doesn't agree with that at all. So he cries out to God about this, and he says, "Well, God, that's fine that they come and punish us, but what's going to happen to them after they punish us?" And so he goes back to God and he begins to pray again, and he says, "I will stand my watch." On chapter 2, verse 1. I'll set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. You see, I want to know what God is going to do. What God is going to do in reference to these people that are coming to destroy this nation, or take captive this nation, or punish this nation for their wickedness. He knows that this is coming because God has told him this is coming. You see, I've called it life lessons from a prophet, because from this prophet we can understand that sometimes God delays his answer to our prayers because he knows when to answer and when we need the answer. And sometimes when God answers, it's not exactly what we want to hear. And I'm sure that Habakkuk, at this point, being a God-fearing prophet who loved his people, did not understand, did not like this answer, that God was using a wicked nation to come and punish the nation of Israel, who served the true God, even though at this point in time they had gone far astray from God and were being disobedient to the Lord. And that's why he tells God, you cannot look upon the wicked, those who deal treacherously, and yet you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he tells God. Why do you make men like fish in the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler over them? Why do you allow them just to come in and destroy this nation? He wants to know. And so now he says, I'm going to continue praying. I'm going to continue watching to see what you say. I will stand my watch, and I will set myself upon the rampart and watch to see what he, God, will say to me, and what I will answer when I am corrected. God, without delay this time, responds to him and tells him to write the vision, to place it squarely on tablets, make it plain. The vision is for an appointed time, and it will come. It's going to come. And then he tells him, behold, the proud, his soul is not upright in him. He's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, because it is Nebuchadnezzar who is leading this army that is defeating all these different nations. And he's telling him, he is coming. He is proud. That is true. He is arrogant. His soul is not upright in him. And because of that, he's going to do what he's going to do. And he took the nation of Israel captive. And the Bible tells us that Jeremiah prophesied about that this nation would go captive for 70 years. And they would pay for their disobedience. but not only just their disobedience of not giving rest to the land, but also the very fact that they are not following God and they're worshiping idols and they're doing all these abominations before God. You see, and he's telling them he's coming. And he is what he is, but he is the one I'm using. We may not like how God is going to do something, but it doesn't mean that God is not favoring our well-being, because God has our well-being in mind. He has the best intentions for you and I. We may not understand his purpose, like Habakkuk didn't comprehend what God was doing at this moment, but Habakkuk was willing to accept what God had said. That's why he said, I will stand here and I will hear. I will answer when I'm correct, and I'll watch to see what he will say to me. But the thing is that God tells him that in this time that this is going to happen and this nation is coming. And yes, this is a proud and arrogant king who will be cruel and will take them captive. During the time of their captivity, the just shall live by faith. Now, as those who are righteous within the nation who are taken captive, they will learn to trust in God. They will lean upon God as their rock and their salvation. They'll trust in him. By the way, that one verse was used by Paul in his epistles in reference to justification by faith, and he used it in Romans 17, Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. He talked about justification by faith, and he used that verse that the just shall live by faith. Martin Luther, the great reformer, he learned about that when he read about justification by faith, and he is the one that started the Protestant movement through the Great Reformation. This man in the 16th century, Martin Luther. But here, what he's telling him is that during that time that they are captive, the righteous, or those who believe in God, those who are just, those who are righteous in heart, they're going to live by faith and trusting in God that he has their best plans in mind. And so God is telling him, though this may happen and the wicked will overcome those who are more righteous than they, yet God has a purpose in this. God is going to rule in this. God is setting forth his purpose to take care of his people in reference to their sinfulness and their disobedience. God is going to come through. And so the just during this time will live by faith. Will live by faith. And God then reveals to Habakkuk the prophet that even though this nation that is more ungodly than they will come and will take them captive, which they did, and they were captive for many years in Babylon. This nation was ultimately defeated by the Medes and the Persians when Cyrus entered into Babylon and captured it for himself. Now, Cyrus was a Gentile king. He was a Gentile king. And listen very closely to that, because God used the Gentile king called Nebuchadnezzar to come and defeat the people of Israel and take them captive. God used a Gentile king, Cyrus, and he put a burden on Cyrus's heart to let the people of God go back to Jerusalem and begin to rebuild the walls and begin to put back together the temple. And God called this Cyrus his anointed, so that this Cyrus would allow his people to go back. So see, we don't understand God's purposes, but God did according to his will. Used the Gentile king who was proud, who was insolent, who was haughty, who was perverted, and used him to bring punishment to the nation of Israel, take them captive, and then use the Gentile king that overcame the Babylonian Empire to bring them back, to restore them back unto their land, so that they could build again the nation. This is God. We may not understand God's purpose. We may not understand how God is doing things. We may not comprehend his divine purpose and how he's going to work it out. And we may question it at times. There's nothing wrong with you questioning God. God did not rebuke the prophet for his questions. God gave him answers. It wasn't the answer that the prophet wanted to hear. Can you imagine that he's praying for this nation? He's asking God for mercies and for revival. He's asking God to bring the nation back to him. And this is the way God is going to do it? He didn't like what he heard. But just because he didn't like what he heard doesn't mean that God wasn't going to fulfill his purpose. We may not like what we hear when God has an answer for us. We may not like what we hear when God has an answer for us. We just may not. But God is in control. And so God showed him that. Further on in chapter 2, down at the last verse, in verse 10, verse 20, he says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." So here God demonstrates to him. See, and this verse about God being in his holy temple, there are several Psalms that quote the same thing, that God is in his holy temple, and that all the land should be silent before him. All the earth, every mouth shall be quiet, shall hush in his presence, because his purposes will be fulfilled. So even as we see what we see in a nation, we know that God is in control. We know that God is in control. We know it. His word says that he's in his holy temple. See, this is what happened to Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 6, the moment that King Uzziah committed the abomination that he committed by entering into the temple to offer incense, something that was only allowed for the priest, he thinking that because he was the monarch, that he had every right to do this. He did not, because God had not called him. God had set apart and consecrated the priestly line to do this, which were Aaron and his sons. You know, the tribe of Levi were the only ones that could enter into the temple of God to offer incense. And so when this King Uzziah, after he had led all this revival within the nation and had brought the people back to God, now this happens. He takes on an authority, something that he should not, takes on this burden of going and offering to God incense, and automatically, the moment he offered, he was struck with leprosy, and the priests came rushing in and took him out. They had to take him away from there before God struck him dead. And this happened because of his own haughtiness. He was proud. He thought that he had every right, because he was the king, to do this. But see, that's a whole different sermon. How God calls us to do a certain thing, and if we try to step into something that God has not ordained us to do, how it could cost us. That's totally different. But here, the point I'm trying to make here is that Isaiah, the moment that he saw that, he says, in the year that King Uzziah died. See, Isaiah was looking on to man. He was looking onto this monarch for governance, for righteous governance. And when he did what he did, that they lost this revivalist, if you will, they lost this person that was bringing about all these transformations for the benefit of the nation. Now Isaiah has lost his confidence. And God comes and responds to Isaiah. God comes and responds to Isaiah. And he tells him, and he says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. And his train, and he was high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. What was God telling him? God was telling him the same thing he was telling Habakkuk here. I am in control. The earth may shake, the land may move, people may go in disarray, but I am on my throne. I still am in command of all things. We have that surety, that assurance that God has all things in his control. And he knows exactly what he's doing. Kings may rise, kings may fall, governors may rise, governors may fall, presidents may come, presidents will go, but God remains on the throne. He is God. He remains on the throne. There's nothing that can change that. And God is showing this to the prophet Habakkuk. He's telling him, I'm in control. I'm in control. I am in control. I have not fallen from my throne. I see all things. His eye runs to and fro through all the earth. He knows all things. He sees all things. Things may look like they're in disarray for us because we're looking at it from the perspective of a finite mind. We don't comprehend the eternal things. But God inhabits eternity. God looks at things from eternity, from the point of view of eternity. He sees things from the past. He sees things in the future. He knows it all. He is in control. So now, because he's in control, the prophet Habakkuk now realizes that God is going to do his pleasure and his purpose, and his hand is going to move the way he wants to move it. That all Habakkuk needed to do was trust in God's hands, trust in what God was doing. And so Habakkuk at this point in chapter 3 then says, O Lord, in verse 2, I have heard your speech. I have heard, and now I have reverence for how you're doing things. I heard it. Didn't mean I just went in one ear and out the other. No, I comprehended it. I perceive now what you're doing. I perceive it. I hear it. And because of that perception, now he says, I am in reverence and awe of what you do because it is your hand that's doing it. See, when God answers, this is what happens when God answers our prayers, when God makes us understand what his purpose is and how he's working in our lives. Faith arises. And you come and you worship God. There's like this reverential awesomeness, this worship. We have this awesomeness about God. And we look at him like, wow, I mean, really, you did this for me. That's what it is. That's how God shown himself to Habakkuk. And Habakkuk now understood. Now his prayer changes. He knows the nation is going captive. Now that he knows. He knows the reason why it's going captive. He knows God's hand in all of this now and how God will punish those who punish the nation because of their unrighteousness. He knows exactly how God is working because God has now revealed himself to him. He knows that God is in control. He knows God's purposes are going to be fulfilled. And so his prayer changes because now he's heard God. He's heard it. He understands God. He understands God's purpose at this point for the nation as a people. And so his prayer now changes. And then he says, O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. What is his work? His work was his people. Those are the work of his hand. These are his people. He says, revive your work in the midst of the years. In other words, in the midst of however long this may take to fulfill your purpose, revive them. Bring life back to them again. Breathe into them life again. Breathe life. It's what Ezekiel saw in Ezekiel chapter 37. When he saw the nation was going to be revived again, he saw these dry bones, and God asked him to speak to the Spirit and say to the Spirit to give life to these bones, and he saw these bones begin to arise, this great and mighty army. He was seeing the nation being returned back to its land, its city, its temple. And this was, of course, what Ezekiel saw. So he saw this, and that's what Habakkuk is asking for here. He's asking for a revival, like bringing forth of life so that these people can go back and begin to rebuild again. He says, in the midst of the years, make that work known. Let it be known to your people that it is you that's working in them, bringing this revival back. And then he says, in wrath, in your godly wrath that requires punishment for their sin. Because remember, these were people that were living under the law. It's not like us, we are under grace. Here, these people lived under the wrath of God when they did wrong. Whatever they did, they had to do righteously. It was their obedience to the law. that meant something. And so he says, in your wrath, remember mercy. Remember your tender mercies in your wrath. I believe, though the Bible does not say, I believe that he saw this like Moses saw it when Moses asked God to see his face. And God said, that's fine. I'm going to place you in the cleft of the rock. When I pass by, I'm going to place my hand over you, and you shall see my backside, but you shall not see my face. And when he passed by, all Moses could do was proclaim, or rather, all the proclamation that was heard was about the mercies and the forgiveness of God. So I believe Habakkuk is remembering. He says, in wrath, remember your tender mercies. Remember your forgiveness. Remember your kindness, your loving kindness, your long sufferings. Bring your people back. Then he realizes in verse 6, he says something here about God. He says he stood and he measured the earth. He looked and startled the nations. What did he mean that he measured the earth? It means that he divided between that which was holy, and that which was profane. God divided between that which was holy and that which was profane in the land. And he brought back the righteous, the holy, the consecrated to do his purpose and do his calling in the nation once again. That's what God did. He realizes that. And so he goes on in chapter 3 as we're going. He realizes that God is in control, that God has made this judicial decree, and that God is going to use once again his people and bring them back through his calling and through his tender mercies. And his faith arises in Habakkuk because he knows God is in control. This faith that arises in him, not because of what he sees, not because of what he contemplates, not because of anything that has happened at the moment that he can look on it and say, wow, God, look, what a change you did. I'm grateful that you did this, and I can see your hand, because he had not seen it yet. But now he has to proceed by faith. And that's something that we have to do. We have to learn that God is in control. And knowing that God is in control, we reverently fear him. We are in awe of what he's doing, whether at the moment it may look like it or not. The just shall live by faith. And he knows that. And he now makes a proclamation that proceeds forth of faith, comes from the faith that is within him, that God is in his holy temple, and that he, Habakkuk, is going to have to kneel before him, bow in subjection to him. The song says that when you don't know the purpose of his hands, bow the knee. Just submit to what God's will is. And so Habakkuk does that, and he makes this proclamation of faith that comes forth in the last part of the chapter 3, verse 17. It's a song of faith. And he says, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. He's saying if we don't return to the land and we don't produce from the land the things that the land produced for us before, that's fine. I'm going to rejoice in God. Though we may not be sheep herders again and produce flock and the herds be there, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I will rejoice in the Lord because his purpose is being fulfilled. I know that he has all things under his control. I will joy in the God of my salvation. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will rejoice in God. Maybe one day we will talk about rejoicing in God in the midst of lack of not knowing what the future holds, but yet rejoicing in who and what he is. I will joy in the God of my salvation. And this is why, he continues, the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, and he will make me walk on my high hills. You see, God is our strength. He is our fortress. He is our God. To whom will we turn if not to him? Though we may lack, though things may not seem like we have the abundance, he says, I will rejoice in the Lord because he is my strength. It is not the things that I have. It is not that I am able to count the quantity or the quality of life that I have. It is not that. Thank God that God has prospered us. And those things are because God has given them to us. What if God decided to take that from us? What would we do? How would we respond? We have to respond like the prophet did. I will rejoice, yet not having. Lacking, he says, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. So, the first thing we understand from the prophet is that he persevered in prayer, waiting for an answer. And finally, God came through, even though he had to wait. Secondly, when he received the answer, he didn't like what he heard at first, but then he understood that God's purpose would be fulfilled. He comprehended God's purpose for him. And he realized that God was going to take care of the nation. And so in his second prayer, we understand that he is going to wait for God to do what he's going to do, and that through faith they would survive. It is faith that takes us through when we don't understand what God is doing. It is faith that will push us through to victory. Then God showed him that he's in control. We must understand that God is in control. And because he is in control, then it changes for us. We believe that God is in control, and therefore we hear what God says, and we say, God, all right, revive your work. Do what you need to do to draw me closer to you, because that's what revival is. That's what the purpose of giving life back is, to draw near to God. God wasn't just going to give life to this nation for them to continue on in their abhorrent ways or evil ways or unrighteous ways. God was bringing life to them so that they would follow him. So then he understands that God is in control, and he's going to do a separation between the righteous and the unrighteous. And the righteous are going to build his kingdom once again. And yet, through all of this, he realizes, okay, God, but if you take all that away, I trust in you. I'll rejoice in you. Can we say that also? Can we say that if none of this happens, you still will remain rejoicing in what God has done and will continue to do? When God doesn't respond according to what you think, can you rejoice in God? Will you trust him for what he is doing and what he will continue to do because he is in control? I hope so. I pray that is our heartfelt desire, to serve the Lord regardless. To understand that even if we go through trials, God is with us. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. May God bless this word in your heart. Bow your heads with me. Father, I pray that each one hearing my voice will, oh Lord, understand the word, Lord, and the steps of this prophet, and that he speaks to us even today. That through your word, Lord, through this prophet and the life of this prophet, we have learned lessons that we can, Lord, treasure and live with, and have them lessons guide us in our lives. It is in the powerful name of Jesus that I pray these things. May God bless you, richly bless you, and we will see you next week. May the Lord bless his word in your hearts. Thank you for being with us.